Hey everyone, welcome back to the React in-depth series. In this video, we're going to go over the useReducer hook. This is quite a fancy hook. I remember when I first saw this hook, I was like, why would anybody use this? This is so complicated and so confusing. But you will definitely see it a lot out in the wild, especially if you're working on larger projects or with a team. In the industry, for example. It's actually such an awesome hook. Definitely one of my favorites once I started to learn how to use it more. It is really a hook that allows us to deal with managing complex state. Instead of having like a lot of set state all the time. You've probably started noticing that if you started building more things with React and practicing more, especially with some of the examples that we've gone through together. This is going to allow us, no pun intended, to reduce the amount of useState hooks that we have so that we can use kind of one larger like useState, and that's just called useReducer for the most part. So let's take a look at a bit of how this hook works, and we'll go through some code examples together as well. Okay, so to start, what I want to do is just go over kind of an overall understanding of what this hook actually does for us. So as I mentioned, the way to think about useReducer is it's basically just useState. Right. At the end of the day, it functions pretty much the same as useState, and we'll see this in action shortly once we actually code this out in React. But really, the point of this is it allows us to manage kind of multiple or more complex states. So if you think of the way that we've been using useState so far, and that it's generally used, you generally want to use useState when you have, like, say, a number or a bunch of strings or something like that. And it's much easier to reason about that state when that state is like split up into little itty bitty parts that all are easier to think about and manage. But what happens when you have much more complex state? Like, let's say it's an array, or it's an object that has multiple keys and values, or it's just pretty much a lot of your entire application is stored for that component in a very complicated state. And instead of creating a bunch of use states, what we can do is kind of reduce that down to a function that manages the state for us, and that is called a reducer, which we'll see. So we're going to use this reducer idea to manage our state. And again, it's really, really important that you understand useState and useEffect in order to make this the most value out of this hook, because at the end of the day, the rendering logic, which is kind of like when does this hook run? When does the re-rendering happen? How does this work in the kind of life cycle and component hierarchy of things? We covered a lot of that stuff in useState and useEffect. And useReducer is really just an abstraction on top of useState that allows us to manage state in an easier way. So make sure you understand those two hooks at least before trying to understand useReducer. All right, so what is a reducer? I want to kind of just start with this really fundamental premise before we start getting into the actual hook itself, because really that's where the name comes from. And in order to understand how the hook works, we should understand how a reducer works. So generally speaking, reducing this reducer function idea comes from kind of like functional programming for the most part. And at least in the context of React, but also most of functional programming, the way that a reducer works is really it's a function that takes a previous state and it just gives you a new state, right? It sounds simple, and it is. It is actually quite simple. It takes something and it gives you something. It takes a previous state and it gives you a new state based on that previous state potentially. Right? So if we look at it as like written out in code as like a function instead of in English, we would probably see something like this, right? This is function. Now we're calling it reducer. It's taking, in this case, a state. I'm giving this thing an action, which we'll see is going to be valuable, but this is like the thing that we want to do to that state to change it. And then we're going to return some new state based on maybe the previous state in that action. Okay. So what is an example of this? Like, let's not think about React for a second. I just want to kind of bring it back down to just generally what a reducer is and some of JavaScript that we've seen before. So a lot of you have probably seen this before, right? Array.reduce. And the code looks something like this. We can take an array, like in this case, an array of numbers, and we can call reduce on it, and we can give it a function as well as a starting number. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce down our elements down to kind of one value, which is kind of the value 6 in this case, because what this reduce is doing is creating a sum. All right. So the way to think about this is that we are taking a previous state and we are getting a new state. So I just want to really hammer this in, and we'll go through this as an example really quick together. So I'm going to pull up VS Code. I'm going to create a new file here. I'm just going to call this Array.reduce.js. Okay. And in here, what I want to do is I want to just do that exact example. So I'm going to, maybe you'll see it like this. So I'll do it slightly differently. Like for example, I'll say hello, and then I'll say, I think I have my linter going on here. This is const array equals hello. There we go. I always forget how to write JavaScript sometimes. Hello, my name is, and I'll just say monkey. Okay, so I'll go with that. So we have an array of strings, for example. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, we can call reduce on it. So I can say, and I'm going to store this in a variable just so we can see it being logged out. And I'll say reduce array is equal to, we're going to take our array, we're going to call reduce on it. Now reduce takes a function and it takes a starting value. If you don't provide it a starting value by default, it's going to use the first value. So we covered this in the Array.reduce JavaScript series. So if you want a bit of a refresher on that, definitely check that out. So I won't go too deep into that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take, I'm going to rename these just so it fits kind of the paradigm of React that we're going to be looking at together. I'm going to call this previous state, and I'm going to call this current state. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to reduce this this array down, and every single loop, I'm actually going to put a log so we can see the previous state and the current state, and I'm also going to see the result. So I'm going to console.log, and I'll say previous state and then the current state, just so we can see that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to concatenate these together. So I'm going to say return the previous state plus the current state. And at the very, very end here, I'm going to console.log this reduced array. Okay, so I'll pull up my terminal here, and it's a bit cut off here, so hopefully you can catch all that there. And I'll just run node, and I'll run my array-reduce. And what we'll see is that initially we're going to have nothing being logged for the previous state. So you can see that in this case, the previous state is actually an empty string. So if I show you what I mean here, I'll just put a dash here and just run that one more time. Run that one more time. We'll see that the previous state is actually a dash. Okay, so just so you can visualize that, it's actually an empty string, but since it doesn't show up in the terminal, it's just going to be kind of nothing right here. So we get previous state is nothing, new state or current state is hello. And then that gets set to be the previous state for the next loop. Then we get previous state as hello and then my. Then we get hello my concatenated and then name, right? So we're always getting the previous state. Then we can do something with that previous state if we want with the new state. So the way to think about this in the context of what we're going to be seeing is really, we're just going to rename this to the action that we want to do. So for example, if I said, instead of current state, and if I call this action, that's what we're going to be seeing, and we would rename that right here as well. Okay, that's one main change that we're going to do. The other change is that we're technically not really reducing always over arrays like this in a loop. So we're going to borrow this concept of having a previous state and a new state that we want to change it to, and we're going to return that new state from this function. So what this function is doing is taking all the previous states and then returning a new state based on that list of states, because it's an array method. What we're going to do is a bit more general. We're going to take a previous state and return just a general new state based on that state. And we're going to be coding this reduce function. It's not going to be built in like it is with the array reduce. Okay. So let's switch back to the slides here. And again, the way to think about this is exactly what I just mentioned. So the previous state is, in this case, like the total right here, and then the new state would be whatever gets reduced. So this is the same thing just with numbers. So we would get a sum instead of concatenation. Okay, now this is the mental model we want to use to kind of go forward. So hopefully you have that kind of burned into your mind for now. Let's take a look at how this works in React. So In React, we have a hook called useReducer. All right, and we can import that from React just like useState and useEffect and useRef that we've seen previously. Now this function takes two arguments. Technically, it takes three arguments. We're not going to deal with the third argument for now because I want to keep things simple. And I'll just mention what that third argument is really quick. But there are some cases where we'd use it, but most of the time you'll actually know when you need to use it, and it's not that important to start learning useReducer. So we're going to pass a reducer function, and we're going to code this. Okay, you see this reducer argument right here? We're going to code that. That's going to be a function that's going to do this reducing behavior for us. It's going to take a previous state, and it's going to return a new state. We're also going to give it the state to start with. Just like you saw with our reduce, we said, hey, please start with this state right here. We're going to do the same thing. So if you think about it, we're doing the exact same thing as this reduce. We're passing it the reducer function, and we're passing it an initial state, right? So that's kind of where these ideas all borrow from, okay? What we're going to get back from calling this function, though, is kind of interesting, okay? We're going to get back an array with two values in it. So normally you'll destructure this just like you would destructure, for example, the useState return values. We're going to get back the actual state value itself, which is kind of like the result. And we're going to get back a function. A lot of people call this dispatch. I'll do that as well, but we'll see kind of without using this name, we'll use something similar to the set state functions, but then we'll rename it to dispatch just so that when you see other people's codes, it makes a bit more sense. But really, we're going to get the state value and a way to change that state value, right? So if you don't think of dispatch for a second and you look at this, you're saying, I want you to think like, oh, this is like literally the same thing as useState. Right? If you think about this return values right here, these return values, we're getting back the state value on the left, and then on the right, we're getting back the function to change that state value, which is like the set state function. Okay, so that's pretty cool, right? And that's going to allow us to do some cool things, and we'll see how this is slightly different from useState and why it's it's better for cases where we have multiple states that are related that we actually want to change. So let's take a look at this, and we're going to code this out. Okay, so I had some examples here, and we're going to build up to kind of this idea of dispatching and actions. So let's take a look at the useState on the right really quick. So again, we'll code every single one of these out just so we can actually play around with them. We have a component, and this component is using useState. I got rid of the imports and the exports just because it's not really relevant to this example, and I think all of you by this point can know where that comes from. So assuming all those are done, we have a counter, set counter from useState, so that's going to be some state. We have a function here that's going to be called countup. That's going to call our set counter, take the previous counter, and then add 1 to it and set that to be the new counter. And we have our JSX here, the markup, which is actually going to render to the DOM a count with that counter, and then a button such that when we click it with a plus button inside, when we click that button, it's going to make this counter go up. So we've seen this example countless times, right? It's just going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as we click that button because the state is going to re-render the JSX. Now, how do we take that right idea of a useState and basically refactor it, change it into this version of useReducer instead? So we'll look at this code on the left and we'll code this out. So here I have a function, okay? Now this function looks pretty pointless, and it kind of is right now. So that's kind of the point. We have a function called reducer. It can be called whatever we want. It doesn't really matter what it's called. It's going to take a previous state and it's going to take an action like we saw. In this case, this function is kind of odd. It's just going to return the action. It's not even going to use the previous state. So I'll show you why in a second as we build up these ideas. Now, this component here, if you look at the right side, we're using useState. Here we're using useReducer, but the return values are the same, right? We have counter and we have set counter, and we're using a useReducer. And instead of just passing it 0, we also need to pass it this reducer function, which is right here. Right, so we're passing the reducer function and then the initial value, which is 0, which is matching what we have on the right. The countup function is the exact same. No changes there. And then the JSX is also the exact same. No changes there. right? So literally the only change is pretty much this line right here, where instead of passing it just the initial value, we're passing a reducer and then the initial value. And the reducer is just returning the action, in this case, the second argument. So let's code this out and see how this works. I'm going to put up my terminal. I'm going to run npm create vite at latest to create a new vite project in this folder. I'll call this useReducer. I'll use React and I'll use JavaScript. I'll change into useReducer. I'll run npm install, get that going. While I open all this up here, I can close this file. I don't really need it now. And I'll open up my main.jsx and my app.jsx. So I'll get rid of this index just so the styling is not there. And I'll get rid of kind of all this stuff in here. And I'll get rid of this useState call right here. I'll just replace that shortly. And I'll get rid of all this JSX in here. And I'll just return app or h1 of app, just like that, just so that we know it actually renders correctly, because this is still showing up over here. I just got rid of pretty much everything, so we have a fresh slate for the most part. So the npm install is done. I'm going to run npm run dev. That should start the dev server for me. I can switch to Chrome here. I'll create a new tab and I'll paste that URL in, and there we go. We have our app, and I'll open my inspector and my console, and that's all good. Perfect. So that's all working. Now I'm going to replace useState here. So I'll close this off just because we don't need that anymore. I'm going to replace this useState with useReducer. All right. And we're going to basically do what we saw earlier, which is I'm going to create a reducer function. And actually, I'll do this as a function, reducer. And this is going to be, it's going to take a previous state, and it's going to take an action. And in this case, all I'm going to do is return the action. I'm going to ignore the previous state, and we'll see shortly how we'll actually make use of that. Now, instead of calling useState down here in our app, I'm going to grab these values, destructure them out. So I'm going to say, let's just say counter, set counter. And this is going to equal to useReducer, which we just imported instead of useState. And we don't pass it our initial value right away. We pass that as our second argument to this function. We pass in our reducer first, and then we pass in the initial value. Okay, technically the third argument here allows us to pass a function that's going to evaluate to that argument for the initial argument, for the initial state, sorry. And that's useful sometimes where you might need to just call a function to generate the initial state for some reason, or pass a callback to that function. But when you need to use that, you'll kind of figure out when you need to use that. And the main thing is to know that it does take some initial state, and whether you pass it in directly or with a function that creates that state for you, you have that option. But the core of this really is the reducer and the initial state. So everything kind of looks the same, right? The only difference here between the useState version and this is that this is the first argument and second argument here, and then we're creating some function that's doing something. We're just passing the value through for some reason. All right. Okay, so let me switch back here, and I'll add this as our let's do an h2 here, and I'll say count, and then this is going to be my counter, and I'll just create my button, everyone's favorite thing, creating a counter for 100 million times to practice React. It's just a nice way to show the state very quickly. I could probably also do like a text input or something, but it's okay. I'll just call this go up, or say on click. On click, I got too excited. Go up. Or actually, I'll do handle click, just so you'll see why later. I'll call this handle click. I'll be boring. I'll call this function. This will be handle click. And this is going to call our set counter here. Just like imagine it's a set state. What are we going to do? We're going to take the previous counter and we're going to add 1 to it. Right? Imagine it's just a set state in this particular example with this particular reducer. Okay, now let's see if this works. I'm going to switch back to Chrome. I'm going to click this, and it's going to go up. Lo and behold. right? So that's great. So you're probably thinking, well, okay, this is weird. Like, why would I do this? I don't really know why you would create a function that just like returns the same thing, but then how is it actually going up? This is all confusing. So what's happening here is that when we are dealing with counter actually is just a state, just like useState. setCounter is also just a function to call a change to our counter, in this case, to our state. But the difference is, instead of setting it directly, it's actually going to call our reducer function to set it. So if you think about how setState normally works, we really, all the logic to kind of set that state is right here. Like, we would directly call setCounter with our new value, and that's kind of the control that we have. But what useReducer allows us to do is kind of have a bit more logic that we can kind of push our state through before changing to the new state. So in this case, what we're doing is that this reducer function is getting past the previous state and then automatically, and then it's being passed the action. So let me log these out so we can see what is happening here. So I'm going to say previous state and then the action. Okay. Here's a little trick for you if you like. If you for most things this works. If you surround these in objects, this is like the new object creation syntax. Going to create a key called previous state and then set it to the value of previous state. This is going to create a key of action, set it to the value of action. It works most of the time for pretty much most things in JavaScript, and it's a nice way to tag your objects. So you don't have to keep tagging them with strings. You don't have to do this. I'll just show you what this looks like, just so it's a bit easier to understand. So I'm just going to log these values out. I'm going to log out previous state, and I'm going to log out action. And we expect that to be logged out when we click our button, which is going to be calling setCounter, which is going to be using our reducer function to set the state, but instead of just setting it directly. So let's see what happens here. I'm going to click the plus button, and we see that the previous state is 8, and then the action is 9. And click it one more time. The previous state is 9, and then the action is 10. And again, this is happening twice just because of the way that the state values work in the context of the dev mode. If I click it one more time, 10, 11. Hopefully you can see how this is working, right? We're being passed the previous state, which was the state before it's being changed, which is basically very similar to how in setState we have access to the previous state if we pass our callback function, right? So if you've seen this version of setCounter before, and this is not going to work with a reducer, but we've seen this one, right, where we saw the previous state, and then we said previous state plus 1. Right? If it was a setState, we could do this, and we would have access to that previous state value before it's changed. This is the same thing here, right? We have access to the previous state value, and then we can do something to that. It doesn't matter. The function doesn't really care what we do to it. It just cares what the return value is, and it's going to take that return value and set it to be the new state. And the action gets passed in, or the argument that we're passing into the set dispatch function, or the setState function for useReducer, is going to be the second argument, which is the action, because the first argument gets pre-filled in for us by React to be the previous state. Okay, so this is actually going to be the second argument, which is by tradition called the action, and we'll see why shortly. Okay, so what we're doing here is basically just, this is going to end up being like, let's say 0 plus 1, right? So this is going to end up being 1, and we're going to get 1 as our action the first time we click it, and our previous state would have been 0 because that's what we started it as. So we're going to get just 1 back, and it's going to set, this is basically doing setCounter of 1. You can think of it doing that. All right, so that's pretty cool. Hopefully that one makes sense. Definitely walk through it a couple times just so you can see the flow of data, because once you see that flow of data, this makes a lot more sense. The only kind of difference here is that instead of the setState function doing it directly, we indirectly call this function here, which allows us to do some changes, which we'll see shortly, and then return the new state manually ourselves if we need to make some changes to it, instead of React just doing it right away with regular useState. Cool. So you're probably thinking like, oh my gosh, like, why would I use this, right? Like, this is overly complicated, just so much more stuff happening. And you'd be right? But I'll show you shortly why this is extremely valuable. Now, I want to show you one small change to this. And this is going to slowly build us up to how we should properly use useReducer. Now, you know how we didn't really use prevState previously in our reducer? We'll change that. We'll start bringing that in. So now that we know how prevState works, what we're going to do is, instead of using the counter here in our set counter, we're just going to pass in the action directly. Okay, so we're going to pass in 1 in this case. And 1 is going to be our action. Right? We saw that. We saw whatever we pass in here is going to be the action, and we're going to get back our prevState. So actually, this is the same thing, right? We're taking the prevState, and then we're adding, in this case, 1 to it, which is the action that's being passed in, and we're returning that as a new state. So if it was 0, it's going to be 0 plus 1, and it's going to be 1. And then if it was 1, it's going to be 1 plus 1, and we're going to get 2. Okay, now this is a bit different, and now we're starting to deviate a bit away from the regular useState calls, because with useState, we take usually the previous value and we do something to it, like this. In our dispatch or in our useReducer, we have the ability to kind of deal with a bit of that logic down here in the reducer instead. So we just pass in just the action or just the change that we want. Okay, so let's make that small refactor here. So instead of doing this, I'll comment this out, and I'll do set counter, and I'll set it to 1. Now, if I don't make any changes here, what we'll see is that this is not going to work, because we're just returning action directly here from our previous example just to match it to useState. So what we'll see here is, if I reload the page just so we can start with a fresh set of numbers, if I click plus, it's just always going to be 1. Right? Which makes sense, because it goes from 0 to 1 the first time because we're setting it to be 1. But then it's just always going to be 1. Right? The prevState is always going to be 1, and the action is always going to be 1, and we're always setting it to be action, in this case, returning action. So we want to not do that. We want to return the previous state plus the action. Right? So if it was 1, we want to add 1 to it. If it was 3, we want to add 1 to it, etc., etc. And then we want to return that as the new state, which is going to be the previous state for the next run. Okay, cool. So let's save that, and we'll switch back here. I'll reload again. We're going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., which is nice. So that works pretty well. Cool. So that's a nice change. It's a little bit confusing, because if you see this, it doesn't really feel like it should work, right? Because if you were to do this with useState, it would never ever change. It would always be that value. But that's the difference here between useState and useReducer. We are allowing the reducer to deal with that change behind the scenes for us. And this is where the change is actually happening. So this is kind of where the useState logic would normally go. But what we'll see is, by putting it out into a separate function, we have a lot of flexibility to do some pretty cool things, which we'll see in a second. So we effectively changed, in this case, my line 13 to my line 15. And then we change my line 5 to my line 6, just so that we can start building up to this idea of a reducer. Okay, so now we're getting closer to our final result of this. Now I want to show you next this idea of a dispatch. And this is why I've been using the word action, and generally why the kind of community that uses useReducer in React especially, and even in other languages, uses this idea of an action. So what we're going to do is, I'm also going to rename my set counter to be dispatch, and we'll see why shortly. Okay. We're going to call our reducer with an action, but that action now is going to be more involved. It's going to be an object. So focus on this line right here. Instead of calling our set counter, so just the only changes here is that I renamed set counter to be dispatch. So if that's throwing you off, just remind yourself that I just renamed this to be dispatch, so it's more in line with how you'll see useReducer used in real life. So That's just rename, so we can ignore that. So that's basically set counter right there if you want to think of it that way, but start to think of it in the context of dispatch. But we're going to dispatch out to our reducer an object. And by convention, this is not anything to do with React and not anything to do with like JavaScript in general. We can structure this object any way that we want. I'm going to show you the convention that you're going to see in the React community and things like Redux as well. And you can choose anything as long as it's agreed upon by yourself or your team. It doesn't really matter what you use. This is just a nice way to make it easier for people to understand because it's just generally pretty self-explanatory if you were to read it this way. So I'll show you what I mean. We're going to pass in an object, and that object is going to have a type property. Okay, this is the part that we need for sure. And this type is going to be what our reducer uses to figure out what to do for the next state. So what does that mean? In this case, we're going to count up, right? And we have a button and we want it to go up. So I'm going to say, well, the type of this action is to go up. All right. So our reducer is going to get that object, which is going to be the action. It's also going to have the previous state, which in this case you can see is 0, just same as before. But we can use an if statement and we can see, is the action's type property that we just passed in, is it up? Well, it is in this case. And if it is up, then we're going to take the previous state, which is 0 in this case, and we're going to add the action.value properties value. That was confusing. So we have a property called value here, right? We could probably call it amount or something else. It doesn't really matter. Whatever makes sense for your application and the different type of state that you're using. But we're going to say take the previous state and add that value, which is going to be 1. So we're going to get the same thing. We're going to get 0 plus 1 in this case. But we're also going to, if you don't pass in a correct action type, we're just going to say, sorry, like that's wrong. You can't change the state. You have to check your action type to make sure that you typed it properly or that it's supported in this reducer. Okay, so let's take a look at that together. I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm also going to get rid of this. And what I'm going to do, let's start with the handle click function. I'll change this to handle up in a second, so you can see that we could probably do this with many different functions. And I'll also name this dispatch, just to keep the conventions the same. And I'll say I'm going to dispatch an object, and I want that object to at least have a type property. I'm going to call this up. You can call it whatever you like. Also, you'll see people use uppercase to for kind of like constants and things like that. Traditionally, what you'd want to do is create a separate file with all these different action types. But for now, we'll just keep it really simple, just so that we have the concepts down and we can see some of those later on in bigger projects. And we can call it amount or we can call it value. It doesn't really matter. I'll just go with value to match what I had in the slides, and I'll just say value of 1. Okay. So this is going to go as the action argument to our reducer function. Okay, so now what we can do in here is I can say if the action.type is up, then take the previous state and add the action.value, which is the 1 in this case. Right here, I want to add the 1 to the previous state, which is 0. And it'll just keep doing that for every single time I click this button. And if it's not an action type that's up, then let's just say it's not supported, then we'll throw a new error and we'll just say invalid action type or something like that, right? Now there's many ways to handle errors like this, but we'll just go with the super simple version for now. All right, so I'll switch back to Chrome. I'll reload the page. I'll click up plus, and it's going to go up. 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 And if I open up one of these, what we'll see is that the action has a type and a value, right? And if I open up one of these down here, we'll see that the action has the same type and the same value. The only thing really that's changing in this case is the previous state. If I wanted to go up by 2 every single time, I would come down here and I would change this to like 2. Right? So that when my previous state gets added to the action value, it goes up by 2. So if I reload this and I click plus, 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 it goes up by 2 every single time because the action's value is 2. Great. So now what this allows us to do is get really, really flexible with how we can actually use our reducer. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to see if I can make a down button and then a reset button, just to make you see like how this makes it a lot easier to manage this state. So I'm going to change this to handle up. I'll call this handle up, and I'll change this to handle up down here, just so that we have the function for handling the up button. I'm going to create another 2 buttons. I'm going to call this one handle down, and then this one is going to be handle, I'll just call it reset. I'll make the down one a minus. I should probably put this first. That make more sense. And then I guess it depends what you think of things, I guess. And then the reset is going to be the one on the right. Doesn't really matter the order of these. Okay. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to say function handle down. And this is going to, I want you to think before I code this out, what would we dispatch to make the button go down? And how would you actually code the reducer to do that? All right, so I'm going to dispatch and I'm going to, the same object, right? I'm going to say type, but this time the type is going to be down. And the value is going to be, let's just say it goes down by 1. I'll switch this to 1 as well, just so that we can go up and down by 1 in increments. And you could probably change this using like a state, for example, or something else, so that you can go up by different amounts of numbers. And now I'm going to deal with this type in my reducer. So if I come here, I'm going to copy this line. I'm going to say if action.type is equal to down this time, right? Because that's what I'm dispatching, type of down. Then I want the, instead of previous state plus the value, I want to say previous state minus the value. Okay. Now let's try reset. So if I say function handle reset, well, let's reset this back to 0. So what do we need to dispatch here? I'd like you to think about it. All right, so we're going to do a type, and this is going to be a reset. And then what would the value be? Well, does it really even need a value if you think about it? Because we're just going to reset it to 0, so it's always going to return 0. So maybe it doesn't even need a value. So this is pretty cool. So we can do different things here. Maybe some of these have different values or different properties. Some of them don't have anything at all, and they just do some kind of action, right? So in this case, that's what reset's doing. Let's come down here, and I'll say if action.type is equal to reset. Well, I don't have a value, so I can't use that. I also technically don't need a previous state. I'm just going to return 0. Right? That's all I need to do. I just want to make the new state to be 0. That's what I want to set it to all the time when you click on the reset button. I don't even need to know what the previous state was, because it doesn't matter if it was 10 or 100. I just want to reset the new state to be 0. That's what it needs to be. Okay, so let me switch back here to Chrome, and I'll reload this page. Let's see if this works. I'm going to click on minus. Look at that, it goes down. So that's pretty cool. So the action we can see is type down and the value of 1. That's pretty great. I'll click plus, and it's going back up. And we can see that the action in this case is a up with a value of 1. And if I click on reset, what we'll get down here is our, let me do it one more time, plus, and then I'll click on reset. Our action is going to be type reset, and it's going to reset back to 0, right? So I can go up, I can go down, and then I can reset. And we see all the previous and next states over there if we need, and we would want to remove this log probably when we're actually done with all this to make sure that it doesn't clutter up the console. So there you go, right? What we can do though, now hopefully you're starting to see this, and I think one of the things I did always say in my JavaScript videos is like try not to do one-liners like this if possible. In this case, I'm on the fence about it. It's like, okay, maybe it's okay to do one line. Probably better just to always use curly brackets for your if statements. But I wanted to show you something cool that we can do here to refactor this. I also want to condense the amount of code on one screen, so hopefully you can forgive me for that, with these if statements. So now if you're seeing all these if statements, I bet that you have an idea, all right? Let's see if your idea matches my idea. So we just saw this in action. What we can do is we can take our if else's, because that's really what our reducer is doing. We're taking a whole bunch of different ideas and reducing it to some new state. We can just put it in a switch statement, right? Like this. And we can say, hey, switch on the actions type. And depending on which case it is, do that thing. So let's just refactor this really quick so we can see how that looks. So we're going to switch on the action.type. And depending on what the case is, like I'll say case of up, and you probably would want to use like curly brackets for these cases if they get pretty long. But in this case, I'm just going to cheat a little bit and put it on one line, just so that it's a bit easier to see. Case down, and then case reset. And this is going to be minus, and this is going to be return 0. And then the default case, which is what happens when you don't match any of these cases, is basically our else in this case. We're going to throw that error. Okay, so I'll just comment this out right now. And there we go. So we basically have that there. My prettier, I didn't like that. I wanted to reformat it, but it should work. I saved it, so it should have that new version. So that's basically a refactor of our if else to a switch statement. And again, it really depends on which version you like more. Once you have a lot of logic, it definitely is easier to kind of read through this switch statement, because maybe you could have the order of these might be different depending on how you do some things or things like that. But generally, you'll see people use this combination of like actions with types and then a switch statement within their reducers, just like this. So if we come back to Chrome here and I click these buttons, everything still works as expected. And that's pretty cool, right? So what do we have here? Well, we have a way to change our state in a very controlled way from any of our functions. So notice that in our functions here, we don't really have our logic, right? Like the logic to reset, for example, if you look at this right here, there's nothing in this 3 lines of code that tells you how this reset is working behind the scenes, right? I just know that if I dispatch this reset type action, that it's hopefully the reducer somewhere is going to just reset this counter. Same with these, right? As long as I know the structure of these actions, and this is where a lot of people like to use TypeScript, for example, and you can use various different tools to make sure you get these structures right across your team if you have a lot of reducers and actions. But what you'll see is that really we just provided kind of some information about what we want to do, but the actual how we're going to do it can be stored somewhere else, which is really, really awesome. This allows us to modularize our code, and when we're actually dealing with the functions in our components, we don't really need to worry about the actual logic as much because that can be somewhere else. We can import it from another file. Someone else can be working on it. And then if we need to change those values, we don't also have to hunt through our code to figure out like what called this and like all those copy and paste of places that were change that value directly. We would just need to go up to our reducer and change the logic in there, and then that should work for everything that's dispatching that action across whatever is using that reducer, which is really, really awesome. So this is a relatively simple example of having a reducer work. Some good practical examples of what you could do with reducers is eventually what we will see is we'll actually combine this idea with something called a context so that we can manage our state anywhere in our application very nicely. But really, it just allows you to have a very complex state. Eventually, and then we'll do these in the exercises, this state is not just going to be a simple number. It's actually going to be more complicated. And it's going to be an object or an array or some other complex data type. And when we have something like that, we can then use this switch statement or our if-else clause to actually make that work. Now, I do want to point out one thing to kind of wrap up this video, and that is that in our reducer, we need to make sure to always return a brand new value. So what do I mean by that? If we have a reducer, let's just call this a function object reducer. Okay, and we're going to take our previous state and our action. What we don't want to do, or I'll just go even simpler. I'll just say array reducer. Okay, array reducer, just like this. What we don't want to do is manipulate that state directly. It's not going to work. Okay, so actually, you know what? Let me show you what I mean, because I think that this is going to be an important add-on to what we're seeing here for mutability and immutability. I'll call this arrays.jsx. And in here, I'll import useReducer, and I'll call this function arrays, and I'll export default arrays. Okay, so I'm going to create that array reducer here. I just pasted it in into this new file. And in here, I'm going to say const, I'll just call this state and reducer is equal to useReducer. And I'm going to set the reducer function to be this array reducer, and then the initial state to be an empty array. Okay, now this is different from the value of just a primitive type. And in here, what I'll do is I'll return some JSX, and I'll just call this arrays. And what I'll do is in a paragraph, I'll use my favorite trick, which is json.stringify. I'm going to take my state, and I'm going to do null and 2 for the spacing here. And this just allows us to visualize that array nicely. Normally you wouldn't do this for debugging purposes, so I don't have to keep opening up the console, but this is also going to show that there's going to be an issue with this if I try to re-render this component, because I need to actually show this in the actual DOM. So this is really why I'm showing this right here, to actually show this state value as part of the actual DOM. Okay. Now, I'm going to need a button here, and this button is going to be add to array, and I'll just say on click equals add, and I'll just write that function really quickly. Function add, and I'll just say I'll do a dispatch here. So shortly, let me just actually make this function work. Oh, this is not reducer, this is dispatch. Getting confused with which is a reducer and which is what. So check this out. I want to show you what's not the way to do this with a reducer. And this is the same thing as with state. Remember that with useState, we're going to use the object.is function to compare two different objects, object 1 and object 2. And depending on if they're equal, we get true or false. So what's going to happen if we take the previous state and we push onto it? Let's just say let's push onto it our action. Let's just push onto it our action for now. Okay. I'll just make this correct. I'll say dot value. And then I return the previous state. Okay. This looks like it is actually going to work, right? I'm going to take an action. So let's show you what I mean. When I click on add, I'm going to dispatch. Let's just say type. I didn't have the type here, but I'll put that just to match. I'll say add. But the thing I'm using here is the value. And I want to add a value. I'll just say, I don't know, 1337, a number to that array. Okay. I want to push that onto this previous state, and I'm going to return the previous state. So what I want to see in my DOM is that state here, that array has been changed, right? When I click on this button, it's going to dispatch an add type with a value of 1337. I'm going to just immediately push that to my previous state and return that as the new state. Okay. Let me go to my main and I'll import that, and I'll show you kind of the issue with this. So I'm going to import my arrays from arrays.jsx, and I'm going to replace my app here with arrays. And I'll switch back to Chrome, refresh the page, and check out what happens here. So we get our empty array. And just to show you that this is rendering correctly, what I'll do is I'll switch back to my arrays. And in here, I'll put the number, 20 to start. Okay. And you can see that we do have the initial state in there the first time. So that's working just like a useState would work with our initialized value. But check this out. If I click add to array, nothing happens. Nothing is happening, right? Nothing is re-rendering in the DOM. And I'll show you that if you don't believe that 1387 is actually going in there, what I'll do is I'll actually console.log out my, my state here. This is going to be asynchronous as dispatch, so we're not actually going to see it right away, just like our setState calls. But we'll actually, you see that all those got added after I refresh the page, which is exactly what we'd expect, which is the issue here. But if I click on add to array, what we'll see is that these are being added. Right? These are being added to the array, but the DOM is not re-rendering, and that's because we are modifying the state in place. So that's not the way to change state. You would never set state by pushing or popping, for example, from a mutable value. What we would normally do is we would say this. We would instead of doing this, we would return a new value totally. I would take all the value in previous state, and then I would add the action.value to the end, for example. I'm going to create a brand new array, put in all the values from the previous state, and then add my new value to the end. And this is going to create a brand new reference, and then React is going to know that this state has changed because the object.is comparison of the previous state and then the new state is going to be different. And it's going to be able to re-render properly. So if I refresh this page, now if I click add to array, we actually do get the correct value in our DOM, where we're actually seeing that just like we would with our regular setState calls. So you have to be really, really careful with these with these reducers in general, the exact same way that you would be doing things with a regular setState and useState function in React. Make sure that you're not manipulating references, because React is going to be using object.is just like it does with useState. And that's why I mentioned at the very, very start that it's really important to know how useState and useEffect work, because the exact same logic for when an effect runs, when the useState is going to re-render this component is true for this reducer. The only difference is now we have some control over what we're returning as a new state, but the exact same rules apply to the reducer, so that we have to make sure we return a brand new reference. And that also applies to nested values. So definitely be careful with that. There are libraries out there that allow us to return brand new deeply copied arrays or deeply copied objects, which I think like Immer is one, and there's a few other ones out there. There's even libraries on top of React that make this quite easy in general without having to worry about it. So you can use things like push as if it's basically doing this. But really at the end of the day, make sure you understand that this is fundamentally a new object in memory. So object.is is going to be different than if we're using push, where the object reference is the same for that array, and it's not going to be picked up by the diffing algorithm to make sure, in this case, object.is, that the references are different. So it's not going to re-render, just like it would not re-render in a regular useState call. All right, so I went off on a kind of a wild tangent there, but hopefully you find that addition valuable, because it's definitely something that comes up a lot, and we're going to be seeing this pattern a lot if we're using complex objects like objects and arrays, or mixes of them, because generally speaking, our reducer is not going to always be as simple as just using primitive types, which always have different references like this with our number variable. Okay, so I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What I've done is also set up a Patreon, as well as YouTube memberships, as well as super thanks. So if you want to contribute that way, feel free to do so. What we'll do in the next video together is go over a bunch of exercises to practice this exact concept, to make sure that when you're using the useReducer hook, all of this stuff and all these kind of things that can bite you and caveats, and just generally setting things up and making it work, you're comfortable with. And we'll go through a bunch of examples to make that stick. And what we'll do in the video after that is introduce another concept called useContext, which is a way to share values across different components all the way down a very deep React tree. So we can actually combine this idea with useReducer, which we see a lot in React applications, to create like a global kind of state, or a state that is shared by many different components depending on different parts of the tree that we want that state to be shared. So very, very cool stuff coming up, but definitely want to make sure that these concepts are clear to you, as well as the concepts with useState and useEffect. So until the exercise video, I will see you later. Bye-bye.